Welcome again to Africa Day 2025. Yay! The time got ahead of us, enjoying our African music, African luncheon, but we are ready to move ahead to our next keynote speaker who is here in person. And I'm really sort of pleased and excited to introduce him. Just personally, Thomas Kwasi Tieku and I go way back and have been collaborators in the Scholarship of Africa for a long time. So I'm so pleased that he accepted our invitation to join us on this important, topic of Africa in global governance. Let me introduce him and then have him invited up to provide his keynote speak. Thomas Kwasi Tieku is a professor of politics and international relations in King's University College at the University of Western Ontario, and he is also and that's in Canada. He's also the Vice President-elect of the International Studies Association, the ISA. Congratulations on that, Thomas, on that appointment, a very important appointment. He's formerly the Director of African Studies at the University of Toronto, and he's also the Carnegie Diaspora Scholar in the Legon Center for International Affairs and Diplomacy at the University of Ghana, Legon. Tieku's current research is supported by the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council, and it focuses on international organizations. He has received the Excellence in Teaching Award from the University of Toronto, and he's also received the Ontario Undergraduate Student Alliance Award, the Hugh Mellon Excellence in Research Award from King's College, and the Best Article Prize from the Review of International Studies and the British International Studies Association for his work on the Legon School of International Relations in Ghana. Thomas Tieku has authored, edited, or co-edited 4 books and written over 45 refereed book chapters and journal articles. His latest co-edited book is The Politics of Peace Building in Africa, and I should also refer you to his article that is actually called Africa in Global Governance, or African Perspectives in Global Governance. So he has a lot to say on this topic as well. He has consulted for various organizations, including the United Nations, the World Bank Group, and the African Union, and the Government of Canada. It's my pleasure to welcome Professor Thomas Kwasi Tieku as today's keynote speaker.
So this is what happened when you get such a flattering introduction. The only place you can go to is down. So thank you so much, Professor Duce, for that wonderful introduction. And it's a great pleasure for me to be here, and in particular, to be in a place that is so diverse and celebrated. And in particular, within the current context, having a provost stand here and indicating that DI is in the DNA of the university, and they are going to continue within the current context. So I'm so pleased to be here. I'm wondering if we could get wonderful. We could get this afternoon, what I want to do is to speak to you about African perspectives on global governance. I'm a kind of a moving type of individual, so I'll be moving it quite a little bit. So I'll try to make it more interactive rather than speak at you. I want to speak with you. So feel free, if you have to stop me and ask a question, feel free to do so. But what I want to do is to talk, first of all, about what African perspective is, and how do you intellectually identify it and do it in a much more rigorous and nice way. It's not a blasphemy to talk about African perspective. Perhaps this audience, I'm just preaching to the choir when I say African perspective. So the main message I'm going to send across, in case you fall asleep, is this: that I'm going to make the counterintuitive argument that, contrary to what you read in the press and what we read even in the academic, in journals and books and so forth, of which I am guilty as charged, that Africa is marginalized. African perspective are on the margins of global governance. I'm going to make the argument that that is not factually accurate. In actual fact, African perspective or perspectives are mainstream in global governance, and I'm going to show you where it is mainstream in global governance. Okay. I know very well that by suggesting that, or by making a reference to an African perspective, I am in some ways risking the idea of being overgeneralizing, because it's a huge continent. Homogenizing, because the tendency for you to use the views of a few elites, especially those who have privileged access to education and information, as that of African perspective, is going to be high. I'm aware that I'm also talking about complex and diverse continent. So I'm aware of all those things, caveat, and yet I'm still going to insist that we can identify African perspectives on global governance. Let me just show you, I know very well that, let me talk a little bit about when we say Africa is diverse. It is really difficult to tease out what African perspective is, right? It's not even easy to identify what the perspective of the United States is, let alone the perspective of a continent that is 3 times the size of the United States. 1.2 the size of Europe and North America combined. So that's how large it is. It's the second largest in terms of large mass. I'm also aware that it is also a continent of complexity and diversity. It is a continent where you can have a very complex mix of a state system. You can have the oldest state in the world that we know, Ethiopia, over 200 years old. And then you can also have the youngest, South Sudan, right? It's just only, so you see the diversity in terms of the state complexion. You can also have, in the same state system, large states, such as Nigeria, in terms of population, almost close to 230 million people. And then you have a very tiny part of the continent. If you look at Seychelles, hopefully I'll be able to. I was trying to use to point Seychelles Island. It's just under 100,000. So that should show you the diversity. It's also one of those continents where we don't even have a firm grip of what constitute or the number of states within the African system. North America, we know the number of states in North America, Asia, but Africa, we don't. You can say it's 54 states, but if you're on the African continent, you can't say it is 54. It's actually 55 because of Western Sahara, but outside of Africa, it is 54 states. So I just want to talk about the complexity of the things that we are dealing with here. It is also a part of the world where it is also diverse linguistically. A third of all known languages are spoken on the African continent. third of all ethnic groups that we know to are on the African continent. And we can also talk about unmatched diversity and so many differences. Okay. I'm also aware that I'm also talking about a continent that Charles Poet called it, or a place Charles Poet in his words is remotely global. It is dynamic. It is really connected to the globe, historically. And so speaking about traditional, static, when you find in literature, but on the ground, it's really connected. Just let me give you a classic example. Go to any remote part of the continent. You will see people over there, you may be thinking, oh, these are very, traditional society. But just pay attention closely. You'll be seeing American t-shirts. You'll be seeing, Chinese artifact. You'll be seeing it's globally connected, and it's not just recent. It has always been a very global site in terms of its connection to the Indian Ocean, to the Chinese historically. So it's a very dynamic kind of continent that we are talking about. Having said all of that, I'm still going to say that we can still identify what African. How do you do it? And I'm going to do it. To avoid it, I'm going to do it by placing the emphasis, the analytical emphasis on the African Union. And I'm going to talk about how you can use the African Union as a conduit through which you can tease out the African positions. And some of you say, but African Union is just only one organization. I'm going to make the argument that, in actual fact, it's more than that. And that's what I'm going to say. For those of you who don't know about the African Union, and if you give me the chance, I'll spend the whole day talking about the African Union. So I'm not going to do that. What I'm going to do is just to talk a little bit about it, and those who are interested in the question and answer period, we can then go much more deeper into it. Except to say that, I wouldn't even talk about it, but because of the social context, except to say that it is an organization that was created in 2021, and I want people to underline that. But it is socially constructed as an organization that emerged on the scene in 2022 because it was politically launched in South Africa, and given South Africa's linguistic and linguistic as well as intellectual dominance, it managed to spread the idea that it was created in 2002 because then it links it back to South Africa. But actually, it was 2001. And of the 14 objectives, 4 of them are supposed to focus on Africa's international relations and Africa's relations with the rest. So it is actually mandated to identify and promote the common African position. So using the African Union is not out of the ordinary. It is the representative of the continent of Africa. And I'm going to use that one then to use it to talk about how the African Union has used not just only develop a common African position, but use it to assert Africa's agency around the world. And that's what I want to spend the time. So I just pull it out a little bit for those of you who are legalistic. Article 4D and Article 3D and 3I. The 3D says that African Union is supposed to promote. You can promote something only when you know it. So they have to define it. And then defend the common African position. So if you want to know what African stands for, the place to go to is the African Union. And I'm going to go through some of the common positions and then show you how this is done by the African Union. In some cases, kind of a lesson for other international organizations if you want to assert the agency of your organization, of your territory, and in some cases of your continent. So very interesting kind of processes that the African Union has used to be able to do that. So the African Union has taken on this mandate that it's got a right to be able to identify and promote it by coming out with a common position on a whole host of global governance issues. So, and I'm going to go through just my teaching assistants, research assistant put this diagram together in a way. By our count, there are about 34 different common African positions on global governance. And some of them, they start from common position on a common African defense and security policy. It is perhaps one of the few continents where it has got a common defense policy for the entire continent. And it's not just only a policy document, it's actually a binding legal document. And one of them, just one of the things that I would throw out here, if you watch carefully, of all the regions we have in the world, Africa is the only place where there's no nuclear state and no one is aspiring to create nuclear weapons because it is against the Africa international system to do so. There's a legal bind. So when South Africa was joining the African community after the apartheid, one of the things that it has to do was to renounce the idea that it has no ambition to develop nuclear weapons. This is part of the common African position. So some of them are legal binding. Others are just a framework document for negotiation. So if you look at all the various UN climate summit meetings, all of them, every climate summit negotiation, African Union will come out with a common position, and all the 54 countries are supposed to use that one as a baseline for negotiating. So that's one. So if you look at the climate in terms of the climate negotiation. Others are big development blueprint or roadmap of development, such as Agenda 2063, which was developed and adopted by the African Union in 2013. And that is the development framework that the African continent is using as a guide for it. So the point I'm trying to say is that if you really want to know where Africa stands and the position that is taken, you go no further than look at the African common position, and all of them are outlined over there. Others are advocacy documents, such as the Ezowini Consensus, which articulates what Africa would like to see in a reformed United Nations Security Council. So if you watch carefully, when the South African ambassador was talking, he was talking about South Africa pushing for 2 permanent seats of the UN Security Council. It's because of African common position. And every ambassador here, if you are talking, that should be your talking point. You can go outside of it because that's what the African common position really is. So some of them are, they are not just only documents that exist, as I said, that exist only on paper, but a number of them have been integrated into various, and I want to take you through how the African Union has used this to assert Africa's agencies in different parts of the world and use it to demonstrate why Africa is not on the margins of global governance, but actually at the heart of global governance. So I'm coming from Canada, so why don't I start from Canada? And the first thing that I will tell you is that Canada just announced its Africa strategy just last month, 6th of March. And at the heart of that particular strategy is this idea that henceforth, from 2025, anytime Canada is going to disburse its aid, is going to use the Agenda 2063 and its own feminist foreign policy. Canada's major foreign policy called feminist foreign policy, as a yardstick to determine aid on the African continent. If you know how policies are developed in Canada, this is a big deal, right, in the document. There were about 600 submissions, of which I led, for example, the Continental African Scholars in Canada, including university chancellors and so forth. we got only not even one line in that document. Yet African Union just not only got references to its position, but Canada is saying that going forward, that is going to be the yardstick upon which its money is going to be distributed. So that should tell you the extent to which this African common position are very, very important. And the reason why Canada did it is because for the last 4 years, African Union intentionally, knowing that Canada was going to develop a strategy, introduced this idea of a high-level dialogue with the Canadian government. Every year in the last 4 years, they've been having high-level dialogue. And through that high-level dialogue, they managed to socialize Canadian political elite to accept the African position as a basis upon which you do that. This didn't used to occur within it. So that's the first thing that I thought that I would draw your attention to. So you see, talking about Africa on the margins, if you are in the strategy of a developed country, you cannot say that you are on the margins of an international system. The second thing that I'm going to outline is the African Union using its coordinating authority to assemble a single slate of candidates anytime an election is going to be held for any global position. So anytime there's going to be an election and Africa is qualified, African Union will say, every African country submit a candidate. We will screen them and then decide which of the one that we're going to support. As soon as African Union does that, that candidate becomes a front runner because Africa constitutes almost a third of UN member states. So you have usually a bulk of almost 30% of the vote already blocked for the African candidate. And that allows the African candidate to win. So my research assistant, we cracked the numbers to see, in terms of geographical representation, the current leadership of the top 18 international organizations around the world. And just look at the diagram over here. Look at it. Africa has almost 28% of all top leadership of global organizations. The region that comes next is where Europe and Asia are 22, right? All the others, North America and others, just a very tiny fraction. So you can't claim to be on the margins when your people are the one running international organizations around the world, right? So if you talk WTO, World Health Organization, and International Olympic Committee, Zimbabwe just won election there because there's always a common slate of candidates, and the African Union uses it to be able to pursue it. Okay, so that's the next thing that I want to touch on briefly is the African Union also has been very smart in the last 20 years in terms of using its convening power to bring African issues and put it on the agenda of global governance institutions. And if there's one place that you want to see whether you are having an influence, it will be in the realm of security because that's very prominent and very sought after. So let me take you through the UN system and see how Africa issues have become dominant on the agenda of the UN Security Council in the last. So if you look at the UN Security Councils in terms of issue on the agenda of the Security Council, 60% in the last decade have been about Africa or related to Africa, right? And not only that, Africa has also transformed the language of peace missions, and in particular, peacekeeping. If you watch carefully, the language of peacekeeping is becoming passé, is becoming outdated. Why? It was because of the African Union, both in terms of practice and in terms of the way they talk about it. So peacekeeping, the language has changed from peacekeeping to peace support operation. Because the African Union said, peacekeeping doesn't work for us when it emerged on the block. So we're going to do peace support operation in which you put civilian at the heart of the operation. And if you have to use arms to be able to protect that civilian, you do it. It's not going to be the traditional peacekeeping where you are just there as an impartial player whilst people are being killed. And you say that it's only for self-defense. So Africa introduced the language of peace support operation, which is combat heavy. And that has made the UN, that's also part of the reason why most African countries are now pushing almost all UN peacekeeping outside of it. So African countries began to realize that traditional peacekeeping doesn't work for them. So a number of them asked UN to pack their bags. So at the moment, traditional peacekeeping, it's not like you're not likely going to see it. Part of it has to do with African Union advocacy. I remember when it started, and Dr. Duzi, I remember one of the African Union high-level retreat that happened. That's where we really bonded. So usually we go to these meetings of high-level president, ambassadors, and then we academics, they put us somewhere at the back, right, in the room of presidents. So the two of us, usually you have maybe 2 or 3 of us, right, globally, who will be at the meeting there, and then we bonded really well during that particular meeting. So that was when the African Union introduced it, when the African introduced the idea, you see people just rolling their eyes. I remember but at the moment, UN is not talking about it anymore. Over a 10-year period, they've been able to display the language of the African. You can claim to be on the margins when you can change the discourse of the most important way of doing peace in the world, right? The same here too, only African Union, Peace and Security Council holds annual consultative meeting with the UN Security Council every year since 2007, every year. When the meeting started, African Union initially said, okay, UN, do you want us to first meet and then have a conversation about peace and security issues? Initially, they were not happy doing it, and then they just, okay, it's just going to be one time only. So I'm going to have that consultation with you, and then we'll do it in New York. African Union said, okay, fine, we'll come over. So they came over to New York. They did the meeting. 2008 said, how about you come to our also territory and also have another meeting? And over time, it's become a rotational thing. And everything that is discussed there, mostly you find them on the agenda. And this is how African Union gets most of the African issues on the agenda of the UN Security Council. And that's part of, because they meet first, it's supposed to be informal, but they discuss it and they lay out the issues. Once you go to the UN Security Council, you have no choice but to talk about those issues, because if you don't do it, they will remind you all the time. So that's what, it is only Africa that at the moment, the UN has passed a resolution making it possible for UN access contribution to be used to pay for a mission that has been mandated by the African Union, not by the UN. It's the first of its kind. I remember when African Union started advocating for it, and this was the language of Congolese Arise, to say that there's no way we will do that because it's going to amount to someone calling the shot and we paying for it. Fast forward, this is 2012. 2023 December, UN passed a resolution saying that the African Union can now use no other region can at the moment access UN contribution to do that peace. You cannot be in the margins when you have that kind of position within it. Just to give you a little bit, for those of you who like statistics and who like, so if you look at the UN, as a result of African Union advocacy and influence, if you look at it, over 60% of all field missions in terms of UN presence is on the African continent. Right? Asia doesn't have it, Europe doesn't have it, Latin America doesn't have that. Country-specific meetings, 70% Africa, and then peacekeeping, we know that about 70%, and an agenda of the council is on the UN. So in other words, there's nothing marginality over here. It's at the heart. A lot of the things that UN security will talk about is about Africa, right? And that is the broader point that I want to make. Okay. So the point I want to make, and the bulk of my talk, is that I wanted to spend the time to say that for those of you who are in the PhD program, that the idea of talking about a unified African perspective is difficult, but it's not impossible. Don't let anyone tell you you cannot do it. Right? Don't let anyone tell you that you can't do it. I remember part of the reason I wanted to really underline this is that when I started my career, as soon as I start talking Africa this, you see people rolling their eyes. They just don't want to hear it. Africa is so diverse. How can you be talking? I talk about Nigeria. And as much as I tell them that you cannot force me to only identify myself with a state, in actual fact, talking about myself and defining myself in only state-centric terms is actually colonial, right? It's a colonial way of often thinking about it, that you think that the state is only the identifiable marker for me. Go to the African continent, people, the first point of identification is not actually their state. There are other identifiable markers. So I want you to say, when you go and you say, I want to talk about the African position on this, there's nothing wrong with it. You can do it and do it intellectually rigorous, right? And you can do it either through the African Union, but there are other ways of doing it. But in my own work, I wanted to say that I use the African Union and I talk about African position. And the piece that Professor Duze referred to it, actually wrote, it was an African perspective, not African perspectives. And I justify. So don't let anyone tell you that you can do it. The second message that I want to leave you with is that you can identify that African Union perspective, and we should all take seriously, if you do Africa, take seriously the African Union. There's often the tendency, because of our background, to think that African Union is this organization that exists somewhere where they pass resolutions and nothing gets done. And you hear that in the literature all the time. African Union is this institution that just takes Western money or donors' money and does not do a lot. I want to say that it does a lot, but you have to open your eyes and you have to take your time and do the research before you be able to saw it. That's the next message that I wanted to leave you with. And I want to leave you with a message that if you look at the world, global governance, from the vantage point of the African Union, Africa is not marginal. Africa is at the heart of global governance, and Africa is one of the continent shaping and in some cases constructing and reconstructing the new world, the world that we are building. And I thank you so much for listening to me, and I'm looking forward to the discussion. Question, keep them coming.
Thank you so much, Professor Tieku. Very, very insightful and informative presentation. So, given another divide, that those external to Africa usually impose on Africa is sub-Saharan Africa versus, North Africa. Taking North Africa out of, the African unity, experience. Can you, speak to your insights, the knowledge? I mean, the meeting that you refer to that we were at was in Egypt, in Cairo, about 10 years ago. But can you talk about, Egypt, Algeria, Tunisia's, commitment and, historic solidarity to the African Union on the one hand, but, Africa as a single, continent on the other? Thank you.
Thank you for that question. And I have been on record to have said that the language of sub-Saharan Africa, it's one of the most illiterate phrases that you can ever use if you study Africa. And I'll tell you why it is illiterate. Apart from the fact that it is not even geographically accurate. It's also a demonstration of a lack of understanding of the history of the continent, right? Libya, the northern part of Africa, has always been a central feature of the continent, historically, to the extent that prior to Africa's encounter with the Arab world, the entire continent by Europeans and Rome referred to the entire continent as Libya. Libya was a reference point for the continent, right? Before it moved, and then when the Arab encounter from the 4th century BC in particular, the language of Bilad al-Sudan, land of the black, emerged. That's where Sudan got its name from. So the idea that you can disconnect the north from the south is not only historically false, but it also doesn't do justice to the continent itself. I should also point out, though, that you wouldn't find any country that is more committed to the concept of Pan-Africanism than a country such as Algeria. Right? Algeria's foreign policy is built around this idea of Pan-African, and they don't joke with their Pan-Africanism. So the idea of thinking about Algeria as not part of Africa is, to some extent, also doesn't do justice to them. Also has a little bit of racial connotation, let's face it, right? It is the idea of separating the North, because the North you cannot talk about Western civilization without Egypt. And so the idea of separating it to say that these blacks haven't contributed to global civilization. And therefore, all the civilization that we know, Egypt is in the Arab world, right? That's part of, there's a little bit of racial kind of language to it. In other words, I'm telling you, for a student here, and I told Canadians, right, I went to their global affairs, and the first thing is Sub-Saharan Africa desk or department, and then they have Arab Africa and so on. And I told them that you are reinforcing the racial stereotype. You are suggesting that North Africans are Africans. How do you define who is an African? And in what way? If Africans themselves, if they define themselves as Africans, who are you sitting in Canada to talk about? So I'm not the only one who pushed for it, but they've now changed it, and now they've now moved on to what they call the Pan-African Dex. I think America still has the Sub-Saharan Africa within, but my sense is that has to change. And it's up to us to be able to push it. North Africa is an integral part, historically, economically, politically, and socially part of the African continent.
Yes, thank you for your comments, and particularly for lifting up the notion of Western Sahara and the colonial framework for the states that actually exist on the continent. But my question has two parts. One is, given that colonial basis of the relationship of those states, there is also a division in the framing of those that are democratic, so-called democratic, and non-democratic in the construction of their governance. Currently, it's my understanding that, in fact, some of those that might be considered non-democratic or even under military control have chosen to disengage from the colonial framework, particularly the monetary frameworks in West Africa. So I'd like you to address that kind of disengagement in what would be called an anti-democratic state, and its implication for this framework that you have of a singular African perspective. If you could address that tension that might be perceived as a contradiction.
Excellent question about the division between the democratic and then the non-democratic state on the African continent. To some extent, you can say that there's a bit of a tension between them, because the AU came out with a resolution called unconstitutional change of government. It started in 1999, and it was adopted in Lomé in 2020, in 2000. And the idea is that you cannot join the African family, you cannot join the AU if you organize a coup. So to some extent, the countries where coups have happened, automatically you get suspended from the activities of the African Union. The challenge for the AU, though, at the moment is that the countries that are supposed to be undemocratic have caught on with something that the so-called democratic state have not been able to do, which is that there's a huge swell of anti-colonial sentiment among the youth of the African continent, right? Whereas in some cases, you have the mostly elitist part are still embedded within those colonial structures. And these so-called coup makers are leveraging this idea of anti-colonial sentiment, and they have taken power and speaking to the views of the elite, Mali, Guinea, Burkina Faso, and Chad. So this is where the tension really is. And you are right that they've disengaged from the original framework. So they left the ECOWAS because they thought that ECOWAS increasingly is promoting Western ideas and Western values. Okay. My sense is that on one hand, ECOWAS took a very strong position. AU, on the other hand, hasn't taken that position. AU has never been one that says that you have to go back into democratic regime before we engage you. So on one hand, formally, AU has not accepted them into the family. But informally, there's a lot of informal negotiation going on with those kind of regimes. So that's where the tension really is. So AU has an ECOWAS position that has to respect. It's got its norms that it has to respect. But at the same time, they recognize the fact that the views that these military regimes are articulating are the views that AU itself want to articulate. AU wants to distance itself a little bit from the colonial vestiges of colonialism, and therefore speaking to it. What I think is likely going to happen will be that this new regime will be encouraged to undergo some form of democratic transition, and they will be brought back into the AU family in a very formal way. But having said that, I want to tell you that formally they don't come to the AU meetings, but informally they are part of the AU, and the AU is actually, and that's why it's very important, often when you are studying Africa, always to pay attention to the informal part of it. Informality is so important that formally they don't talk to them, they will not invite them to summit, but informally, I know about 3 or 4 times AU delegations have met these coup makers and really working with them. So I think that tension is good. Now also speaks to the complexity of the continent, right? Dealing with a continent with so many different views, and when you are managing such a society, you should be able to manage the complexity. And I think AU will tell you that they have good experience managing such complexity, so they will find a way to bring them back into the fold. They were actually the one that actually told ECOWAS, when ECOWAS took a decision, that if you don't go back to democratic rule, we are going to send the armed forces to overthrow you, as they did, and they wanted to do in Gambia. AU just told them, please don't do that. That will be dangerous for the continent. So to some extent, ECOWAS didn't go in part because of AU influence. And they also know very well that AU was not going to support it. So you see ECOWAS backtracking a little bit from its initial position. That is to say that they wanted to open up the space for dialogue and they didn't want to close it. So thank you so much for that beautiful question.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor, for the wonderful presentation and for taking the risk or for the confidence to present a counterintuitive narrative to the people complaining about marginalization of African countries. But my question is related to that. So if you follow your argument that the continent is not marginalized, in fact, the issues are taking center stage and they're becoming mainstream in the United Nations and in other international organizations. I'm sure people can ask you a lot of questions about this. One of the questions for me is it possible to back that with some result? If this is now mainstream, if Africa can put its agenda in the UN meeting, in Security Council meeting, then there must be some result, a positive impact on the continent. For example, is there economic progress? Is there more security now? Is there peace in a lot of countries now? Is it possible to show some result to back the narrative of, no, you can't complain about marginalization, look at the statistics. We have been putting all our issues in all the stage and they have been part of the discussion. So the question is, can you back it up? Is there any result to show that? Thank you.
Thank you. Can I back it up in terms of, and I like the way, yes, it's all good to be able to say that AU has been able to put African issues on the table. It's all good to say that the construction of the new global governance architecture has an African accent. It's all good to be able to say that AU has managed to get Africans into top position to some extent, who are themselves also going to impose the African views on the AU. But how does it translate into the life of ordinary Africans? Okay, so so back it up, number one. There's so many ways I can talk about it, but I'll give one example to illustrate this, how it impacts on the African continent. If you watch carefully, during the COVID pandemic, of all the doom and gloom that was predicted from the African continent, that doom and gloom did not happen. Part of it has to do with the way the COVID spread, but part of it also has to do with the way AU coordinated and managed it. And there's an article that talked about Africa being an island of its own, the way we address COVID pandemic in terms of coordination that happened and how effective that coordination was. In other words, in terms of public messaging from the Africa CDC and how Africa CDC managed, number one, to be able to get countries to donate vaccine. Initially, they were going to sell the vaccine. And even the vaccine that they were going to give to Africa were the ones that they didn't like, AstraZeneca's and others that they didn't like. Africa CDC, AU just said, you can't do that. And Africa CDC was the one that drew attention to it that we've done the testing. We realized that the vaccine you are going to give to our countries are not the best ones. We don't want it. We want this particular vaccine. So if you look at the distribution of vaccines that were distributed to most African countries, it came through the AU and through the Africa CDC. So most Africans vaccinated, they were vaccinated. AU also did another thing that I thought was very interesting. There were some fake doctors and fake, inventions, including Madagascar and others came. Soon as it emerged, AU would take it and said, okay, we're going to do the lab test. If there's something in there, we'll let you go. If there's nothing in there, we'll tell the whole world that it's not there. So AU did the testing, and Madagascar has to keep quiet. If you watch carefully at the beginning, they said that they had all these, drugs that were, but it was the AU coordination that was able to do in terms of translating it into concrete individual action. I should also point out, and this may not be the best example because anytime you talk about it, people talk about our dependence on external donors. AU has also been very good in attracting resources into the continent, right? In the last, if you look carefully, although people use it to attack AU, but an organization that started with a budget of around 60 million, at the moment running a budget of close to 700 million. And only about 30% is paid by Africans. This has been used by people to condemn, to say, you are dependent on Africa. But I usually tell people that it is a resources that is coming to the continent. We should not. whether you take the money or you don't take the money, they will try to influence you. So take the money. And if they are going to influence your policy, it's up to you. And in fact, there's also a literature that suggests that there's no causation or correlation showing that AU taking donor money has led to a direct influence of AU decision making. There's no actual, it's donors who are fatigued, who often wants to use the dialogue that Africa has to be. In other words, if Ghana does not have to send 5 million to the AU and get European Union to pay for it, that 5 million can go and then do something for Ghanaians. So that is a plus, and I don't see it as negative. In other words, yes, AU can do so much for the ordinary Africans. I agree with that. And to some extent, I always say that AU is an organization that, if it did not exist, it would have been created by African elite. But I'm not too sure if ordinary Africans would have advocated for its creation if it did not exist, because a lot of Africans don't know the AU. A lot of Africans don't see the direct benefits of the African Union. But there are other ways that the AU, and my own work, I will just talk about this and then leave it here. I used to be very critical of the OAU. I thought it was just only the Dictators Club. Until OAU then transitioned to AU, had a small peacekeeping mission in Burundi. And I went to Burundi, and children were named after a squad AMIB. Children were named after AU peacekeepers called AMIB. And then it was there that it dawned on me that perhaps I have to think twice about the way sometimes we think about these organizations. And then why would someone name their children? So it turns out that at the height of the conflict, it was the small AU troops that stabilized, came in and then stabilized it, and the UN then later on took over. And all the credit went to the UN. But it was the AU actually that stopped the war, and then the UN then took over to maintain the peace on the African continent. So the point I'm trying to say is that some of the AU's activities have tangible impact on ordinary Africans. But because they are not World Bank, IMF, and others, they don't have the kind of clout to be able to sell it the way the World Bank is able to sell its ideas. And because of the fact that the AU also doesn't have the money and clout, often we don't see it. Having said that, I have always, part of the reason why I talk about the AU is that if Africans use AU instrument, the continent to some extent will change, because AU has come out with so many things. The only problem is that Africans don't know about them and they don't know how to use them. So part of the reason why I was talking about this is to say that this is how AU is able to do it. If you want to engage AU, if you want to be able to influence, you can take all these common African positions, go to any forum, and then articulate and use it to push for change wherever you find yourself. And that's part of the reason why I wanted to talk about AU African Common Position. But thank you so much for the question.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you so much for your presentation. So I'm sort of curious. I think I do like the argument that African perspective is mainstream. So I think I'm sort of following up on that. I think it's a bold argument, but I'm sort of curious though. Mainstream to what? But also, has it always been mainstream? When did it become mainstream? And so you sort of reference AU, which is also relatively a young organization in comparative to just our history and everything. And I think when you started with that, I think instantly I was sort of thinking sort of a governance system. Does it shape how different governance systems are sort of practiced? And can we, if we look at the continent and the large informal system, even including informal governance system, to what extent, if you say African perspective in relation to governance is mainstream, then I think that would be our starting point. If we reference AU, AU is basically a colonial legacy. And even our democratic systems are all colonial legal systems part of them are a product of informal governance or formal governance, if you want to argue that our governance system has always been formal. So sort of I'm curious, mainstream to what? When can we start the argument? And for what? Yeah.
I like the idea, and so what? And so it is important for us to first recognize the fact that Africa may have been marginalized in the past, but it is no longer marginalized. Africa may have been ignored in the past, but it cannot be ignored if you are organized, if you know what to do, and if you know how to do it. That's the point I'm trying to say. What the point I'm trying to say is that in the past, Africa was in the margins because we were not, one, coordinated, organized, didn't have the advocacy documents, and didn't have the bigger policy instrument people can use as a reference point, right? And that's why it was easy for others. If you look at when the UN was created, only Ethiopia and Liberia were at the table. And when it was created since then, African Union or African issues were always on the margins because we were not organized. The point I'm trying to say, within the last 20 years, because of AU's organization, you cannot say that Africa is ignored from in the global governance. I intentionally talked about only the politics, governance, political governance, and security governance. I can do the same thing in trade, right? If you look at the WTO, part of the reason why the WTO is as a stalemate, people will usually blame India and others, but our Africa group were the ones that actually started this idea that if United States, European Union, and Japan, if you don't open your agriculture, if you don't stop giving subsidies to your farmers, we are not prepared to then open up services and intellectual property and so on and so forth where the big powers wanted to go. And part of the reason there has not been movement is because they don't want to open agriculture, which plays to the strength of the Africa. And Africa says that if you are not open that space, then we are not going to have more negotiations. That's why WTO has been in the stalemate over it. So it's not just only India, but Africa working with India and like-minded states were the one that pushed it. In the past, you know what would have happened? GATT regime, there's a green room. The big players go to the green room, they decide what should happen, and they announce it to everyone. You can't do it at WTO. And that's part of Africa's activism. That's what I'm saying that you can. So I can also talk about all the other forums as well. Okay. In terms of on the African continent itself, I intentionally have bracketed off. Remember, I'm talking about foreign, global governance. I'm not talking about domestic management. When I have, there too, I have my own issues with them. AU, to some extent, has been more effective in terms of helping to assert Africa's agency in the international system than asserting itself at domestic level. There's a complication to it. So member states are happy to support the AU to be more activist in international affairs. But when the AU turns itself to member states, they are saying, we don't want too much interference, right? So that's a subject, but that one is not a subject of conversation. The subject of conversation today, I wanted to say that AU, through the AU, Africa has become a central pillar, a major talking point, a player within it, within the international system. The media may not talk about it, and scholars sometimes may not talk about it that way, and I was guilty because if you look at my earlier work, I was one of those individuals that talk about Africa's marginality. Tim Shaw's book, and if you take most of the African IR, that was our starting point, that we wanted to write because we fear Africa is on the margins. But if you look at the facts in the last decade, that's not the case, and that's why I wanted to draw. So to some extent, I'm also correcting my own errors too, as a scholar.
Hello, Professor.
Yeah, hello.
My name is Anu. I have a question regarding, so there was something you said that I want to sort of, my question stems from what you said. You were talking about the AU, and you had mentioned, I think rather passively, but you said, a lot of people think about the AU as just some organization somewhere on the continent, something like that. And for me, that was it was a clear showing that a lot of us struggle with that identity. We struggle to actually connect with things that mean a lot to the African continent. And so I'm wondering if you know, or maybe if you know of strategies that are being implemented now to sort of address the issue of Africans not exactly having a conformity to identity. And to further just give, I guess, an example for you to know why I'm coming with this question is, I attended this African-centered conference as well here in Boston, and I remember that one of the very first questions that was asked was, when you think Africa, what comes to mind? You know, and it was one of those like game-like questions where you respond, and then the most answers are the biggest on the screen. And right there was food. You know, the first thing was food, next thing was culture. And while that is beautiful and it shows that we understand the level of vibrancy that we have, I think it gives us a perspective as to what we are thinking when we're even thinking about the continent. We're not thinking about these important global issues. We're not thinking about international relations. We're rather thinking about things that are more, like day-to-day, right? Food, culture, and things like that. And so I'm wondering if there's been, strategies implemented, especially by the African Union, actually, to go about addressing this.
Yeah. That should be the next stage of what the African Union, to be able to connect to ordinary Africans. You only see African Union being relevant only when you have a major difficulty and the African Union will get to. So, for example, if you are an albino, for example, in Tanzania, just last month, the African Court on Human Rights, for example, ruled against the Tanzanian government, asking them not to discriminate against people with albinism, for example, right? That's a concrete where those with that particular conditions or those individuals were being persecuted. And the Tanzanian government was not doing enough. The African Court of Justice and Human Rights ruled and then asked Tanzania to report back in terms of what concrete steps they are putting in place to be able to ensure that these are very baby steps, but my sense is that African Union will need to do. I also agree with you that Africans or a lot of Africans, because of the high rate of economic challenges, tend to think about the bread and butter issues. So if the AU wants to be relevant, one of the things that it has to do is to pay attention to bread and butter issues. In AU will tell you that one of the things that they are doing is the African Continental Free Trade, for example, area, which according to them, if it's implemented, will move over 300 million Africans out of poverty. So those are the bread and butter issues that the AU wants to address. AU is also, my sense is that, and this is where AU is also trying its best to be able to address what they try to silence the gun. So they have a position called silencing the gun, of which some of the good work that often is done, it's not the most sexy kind of things, and you don't hear them. So anytime you see a conflict break out, chances are that AU tried or African organization tried to nip it in the bud, and they could not. They were not able to do it. Since I always say that Ethiopia. I'm a Ghanaian originally, but I spent too much time in Ethiopia, so sometimes I like to identify myself as an Ethiopian. If you are in Ethiopia and you are on the northern part, the role that the AU played with South Africa in ending the violence between the Tigray and then the Ethiopian government is something that has not received the kind of attention that it deserves, but has been very important in terms of that. And I will say one last thing in terms of AU connection to it, and of which I think as African students, we should also try to document these things, right? It's because we don't document them well. If you look at the Kenyan violence in 2007, the organization that ended that violence, that appointed Kofi Annan, who successfully negotiated it, although everyone, even including academics, thought that it was a UN-mediated, it was the AU-mediated mission. But because Kofi Annan is so closely tied to the UN, everyone thought it was a UN appointment because he also drew a lot of his backroom staff from the UN system. UN took credit for it. But the violence in Kenya, the settlement in Kenya, was a result of the AU that put in place. So there are a number of things that the AU is doing. It's got its challenges, it's got its weaknesses. I am a number one critic of the AU as well as a number one cheerleader. So figure it out, go figure. I do both as well. So AU has its strength, but it's got its weakness as well. But what I want to convey to a crowd like this is to say that AU is doing a lot, and it's up to us scholars to document them and then to make them available so that when media is talking about it, the media is aware of it and they will be able to tell the entire story.
Thank you very much, Professor, for your good presentation. For the first time, I would say I'm glad that I have gotten somebody inspiring me to know that African Union is a good platform or a tool for us to bring about positive change on our continent. Thank you very much for this. And I just wanted to ask you, from your personal experience and that you have gone through, you addressed us, you actually inspired us, the PhD students. I'm a PhD student here, and I felt really good to turn my eyes on African Union and make sure that whatever I can read or research about, see where I can really, base on to argue for whatever good things that are happening in the African Union. But you are here, and I would like to know your advice for me personally, Seth, who comes from Rwanda, and any other person. What would you advise us in terms of either being constructive in terms of advising on the African Union when we get the capacity like you, to stay on a neutral ground, like where you are? You're a professor here in Canada and everywhere, but you are not in African Union helping there or advising directly. Just going there and they give you a back seat sometimes, just like you shared with Professor Kiki. And I want to know if that's what you would advise us. So we say, no, go there, sit with them directly. If you get co-opted into bad governance and corruption and all those things, find a way of managing them or stay on a neutral ground, just like you're doing. Please advise us on this, or me.
Thank you very much. My name is Ayodeji Awobody, and I'd like to thank the professor for a very eloquent and very clear presentation. My question is going to be a very, very short and simple one. I would like you to backtrack to the response concerning the Sahel African countries, West African countries, Niger, Burkina Faso, Mali, and Chad. Concerning the anti-colonial position that they've taken, how sustainable do you think that position is? Given the structure of global trade and economics, and also the importance of technology in developing the resources of those countries. Thank you very much.
Okay, wonderful. I'll try to be brief. The first one, in terms, do you stay neutral or do you get engaged? My sense is that we have to do it from different angles and from different places. If you think that the best way that you can do is to be able to work for the AU and then do it from inside, you go there and then do it from the inside. If you think that the best way to do it from your own position is to do it from the outside, then you do it from the outside. But whatever you do, you have to be committed to a principled work to say that I am interested in bringing about positive change. And wherever space I find myself, I'll bring about a positive change. Just since you brought up the personal, let me cite one personal. It comes with sometime at a cost. You may be thinking that I'm neutral. I'm not neutral, right? I'm not neutral in the sense, if you go to AU and you say, Professor Tieku, my name is sometimes synonymous with the professor who came here to push the AU to abolish 20% of the per diem. And some of them accuse me of, or some of them are saying that it's because of me that they have not been able to build their houses. Because AU used to have this per diem, 20% per diem added to the UN DSA. And after spending some time at the AU, I realized that some people were just chasing the per diem, right? Instead of being in the office and doing the work. And then they were making money from just traveling. So I wrote a small paper, and I think in Burkina Faso, one of these high-level retreat, I presented a kind of, you talk about neutral, there's no neutral. I wasn't neutral, but I presented as an academic paper. And then it was a full room, and then, the ambassadors and I picked it up. And it became a whole discussion about per diem and its role and its influence and how it undermined the diplomacy. So at that time, Madam Zuma, after the summit, just decided that they were going to reduce the per diem of the AU, and then also say that if you want to travel, it has to be approved by her office. And that meant that a lot of the traveling that was done at that time, he just put them in a ban. And AU staff have not forgiven me for that. Over 10 years from now, and still at the moment when I go there, they complain about me being that. So it comes with a cost too. And talk about that. After that, they never invited me to be part of the high-level panel again, right? So that was my last time but that's what you have to be very principled in terms of doing some of these things. But whatever you do, I think be committed to positive change. Sometimes they would not like you in the moment, but over time they come to appreciate the work that you do. And that has been my experience. I have this love-hate relationship with AU. Sometimes they hate me so much, and then sometimes they love me. So that's the way, and also indication that you are doing something, right? So in terms of how sustainable is this anti-colonial sentiment, my sense is that I am horrible in terms of predicting. So take this with a pinch of salt. But if I'm supposed to guess, my sense is that it is, at least in the Francophone African countries, it is irreversible in terms of Francophone African countries going back to the days where a young French citizen can be in a meeting of which an African minister is presenting and that French young boy diplomat writing the note and then instructing the minister, this is what the minister should say. And I've been in a room where this has happened, where an African minister is talking and a junior person within the civil service telling the African minister, this is what you need to say, and instructing them. That, I think, that kind of time has passed. That direct instruction, direct influence, I think, is a thing of the past, particularly in the Francophone African countries. I cannot guarantee that indirectly colonialism is not still going to be there. And I think the next stage is for not just only Francophone African countries, but Anglophone African countries fighting colonialism at the discursive level. I think at that discursive level, colonialism is still dominant. And also at the institutional level, African universities are still very colonial in their orientation. African government institutions are still colonial, and that, I think, that the next stage of decolonization of the continent. But thank you so much for that question.
Thank you so much, Professor Tieku. That was really fantastic. The sisters that were asking the question about the African Union and its sort of not really being identifiable to a lot of young people, especially young people, in the West. I also wanted to add to Dr. Tieku's, comments that the African Union also has what they call the African Diaspora Clause. The African Union is very conscious of, its identity in the world and engaging its contribution and presence, as a contributor of world civilizations. And so, in the continent, it has divided its regions into 5 zones. But at its onset, it also added a 6th zone. And the 6th zone is the African diaspora. And it boldly says that, the African Union serves African peoples on the continent and in the diaspora. part of the diaspora clause led the African Union to almost make Haiti, at Haiti's invitation at the time, as a full member of the African Union. It didn't happen ultimately, but I think it's still being negotiated. The Prime Minister of Barbados, the woman, is very, very, active in, the Pan-Africanism that sort of, negotiates with, the African Union and CARICOM. So, there is this attempt, at least, by the African Union to foster, a diasporic, global identity in connection to Africans and African descendants, outside of the continent, but to bring them back into the fold. Okay, I just wanted to say that. Again, congratulations and thank you so much to Professor Tieku for, a wonderful address. Thank you.